We're in week 6 of the Bible Challenge. You can start the Bible Challenge any time of the year and just follow through weeks 1 through 52. However, if you did start chronologically this year on the 1st of January, this means we're in the second week of February. We're getting right into the week in which Ash Wednesday will be this Wednesday. And where are we in the Bible? Well, we're right at the end of Exodus, and we are in the middle of the Gospel of Mark, and we are going to go into Leviticus in the Old Testament, continue with the Psalms, and finish up basically the first half of Mark. Exodus ends. Chapter 40 is essentially a coda to the whole book. We've had the people come out of Egypt. We've had the people across the Red Sea. Now they're in the wilderness in Sinai. 9 months after the people enter Sinai, they dedicate the tent of dwelling for the Lord. That 9-month period may well be symbolic of birth, of new life, but as we know, going forward in the narrative, we're going to see that this takes a lot longer than just the 9 months for new life to truly come about, because we have the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Bearing in mind that every time we encounter the number 40 in the Old Testament, we don't need to read it literally. 40 days, 40 nights in the flood, rain. 40 years in the wilderness. 40 in an Old Testament usage basically means a long time. So it is used literally in Psalm 95 when the Lord says, "For 40 years I detested this people." But again, we can read that more metaphorically, more symbolically, a very long time. How long were they in the wilderness? We have no record other than the biblical record and can just think of it in terms of a very long time, more than a couple years. They dedicate the tent of dwelling, and it's at this point that the book ends, that the people can start the journey to Canaan, can start the journey to the Promised Land, which takes us into Leviticus. Now, Leviticus takes its title in the Greek canon from the word Levite. We have priests and Levites in the Old Testament. This is how worship is conducted. The priests descend from the sons of Levi, or the sons of Aaron, the Aaronic priesthood, and then the sons of Levi are the Levites, who are very important in terms of how sacrifices are offered and how, once the temple is built, the temple would be administered. So people are worried about how you get stuff done in Leviticus. This is a book that probably takes a lot of its source material out of the so-called priestly writer, and it's probably a couple centuries later, after the Babylonian exile, when people are getting back to Judea and Jerusalem proper and saying, how do you do this stuff? What's important? What are the rules? How do we live in community? What are the important boundaries? As I say, in the Greek and Western canon, the book is known as Leviticus. In the Hebrew canon, it is known as Vayikra, which means, and he called, meaning, and the Lord called. And so, in Hebrew titles, you basically always go back to the first words of the book, and it's talking about, and the Lord called now and set forth these new rules. The first 7 chapters of Leviticus are basically concerned with rules of what types of sacrifices are to be offered to the Lord. How are they to be offered? How do you make this happen? What are the right kinds of animals? What do you do with the animals when they're offered? What times are sacrifices offered? What are sacrifices offered for? For example, we get a lot of later detail, probably 6th century BC, that relates to the temple, but the narrative in Leviticus, the temple hasn't been built yet. So we have to see how, as the Bible comes together over centuries, this is an evolving story and an evolving code and way of doing things. One of the things we see mentioned in this description of sacrifices is a description of a Holocaust. Now, when we in the 21st century think of Holocaust, we think of it in a very specific sense in terms of what in Hebrew would be known as the Shoah, or the killing by the Nazis of approximately 6 million Jews in a purposeful genocide in World War II. Holocaust in an Old Testament sense is referring to a burnt offering, that which is consumed completely by fire. And you can see how that would be applied in the case of the genocide and machine killing taking place at places like Auschwitz-Birkenau and other extermination camps. Because the idea of the word Holocaust is that there is both an ascent to the altar, you go up to the altar, but also the smoke rises. There's this constant pillar of smoke. If you've seen films of the crematorium at Auschwitz, there's a constant pillar of smoke over the death camp with ash falling over it. This reminds us as well of an inscription found on the barracks wall at Auschwitz-Birkenau in the Hebrew from Psalm 44, "For your sake we are being killed all the day long." Now, Holocaust in the Old Testament sense is an offering offered to God. One can find theological arguments made about that in the 20th century sense, but in the Old Testament sense, we're worried about offerings for sin. Let's not equate the 20th century Holocaust with that. When we talk about a sin offering, however, we're talking about sins that are inadvertent. In other words, this is not talking about intentionally blaspheming God, but you have engaged in something that is unclean. How do you take care of that? And last week we talked about the differences between propitiation and expiation, with expiation being what you do to remove the stain, the burden of sin. Sin offerings are essentially expiatory. They are prescribed offerings to be made to take away the burden of sin. So we get that whole code in chapter 7, and it can make for some very dry or very interesting reading, depending on how curious you are about how things used to be done. Chapters 8 through 10 then get very specific about the ordination rites for the Levitical priesthood, who can be ordained. How are they ordained? How is this organized? Pretty clearly, when we're talking about ordination rites, this is something that includes a lot of material that was written later as the people are actually getting back to Jerusalem and as the temple is being constructed. Then we get into chapters 11 through 15, which is a code relating to legal purity. And we're going to continue in that code all the way for the next couple chapters next week. But legal purity, what is considered clean? What is unclean? Both in terms of food, in terms of people, in terms of practices, in terms of times. Remember, sin is very much equated in all of the ancient world with the idea of some kind of pollution or disease. So how do you get it off you? How do you clean up? How do you get that sin away from you? Whether it's in the case of putting the burden of sin on a scapegoat and sending the scapegoat out into the wilderness, or whether in a Greek mythology sense, how do you identify who the sinner is in your city and get him out of the city so the plagues will leave your city as well? People are worried about infection when they look at sin. Now, we could look at this from sort of a Joseph Campbell history of religions perspective and say that, for example, you're not supposed to eat pigs because people have figured out that in the ancient Near East, without refrigeration, there's some bad things that can happen to you from eating pork and get trichinosis. Same thing can happen with eating rabbits, birds of prey, shellfish, certainly before refrigeration. We can take that history of religions approach. Another way to look at this is to say that the origins of what things are clean and what things are unclean, those origins are at best obscure, but it may relate to trying to differentiate yourself from pagan cultic practice. For example, in the sacrifice of pigs offered to the Babylonian god Tammuz. So we don't deal with pigs because we're not Babylonian pagans is kind of the statement that might be being made there. At best, the origins are speculative. If we look at that in a purely human frame of reference, if we look at it from the frame of reference of God revealing His will, then we would take a different perspective, of course. Now, these chapters do not come up in the Sunday lectionary in the Episcopal Church. We don't encounter these chapters if we go to church 52 weeks a year, 52 Sundays a year, and go for 3 years through the 3 lectionary cycles. We're never going to encounter these chapters in Leviticus. So this is going to be new to most people in the Bible Challenge. Even if you do the daily office of morning prayer and evening prayer, this is going to be new to you. Later on, particularly, we'll get some parts of chapter 19 where Jesus is going to cite them. A lot of the background to what Jesus is dealing with the Pharisees and Sadducees and temple authorities is background that comes up in these chapters, though. So it's worth knowing to know the background that Jesus is dealing with in terms of the sacrificial system that precedes him and that is fulfilled by him. That's as far as we get in Leviticus this week. In the Psalms, we have another 5 Psalms, 30 through 35. 30 and 31, both of them are individual laments. And remember, the structure of a lament basically is a structure that says, I'm in a bad place, God, and why have you left me? Why have you abandoned me? I guess it's because I'm a bad person, but then the lament switches gears and says, but I know who you really are. You're the God who keeps his promises, and you will not abandon me, and therefore I turn to you and put my trust in you. That's essentially the structure of a lament. 30 and 31 both do that for individuals, with 31 having a sort of thematic content that relates to how safety is to be found in God's actual hand. 32, we get a wisdom psalm, psalm of thanksgiving. Basically, we're saying, thank you, God, for showing us your pathway, and that by keeping your pathway, we may enjoy blessing. 33 is a hymn of praise to God, basically a form of prayer saying how great God is. 34, an individual psalm of thanksgiving, written as an acrostic, again, the first letter of each line, forming an acrostic in Hebrew. Addressed to the just, those who are encouraged to join the psalmist in praising God. 35 doesn't really fit any category. It's one of those weird psalms that we can't really say is a lament or a psalm of praise or a psalm of thanksgiving. There are elements of a royal lament present, with the king protesting against false accusations of treaty violations, but it's kind of hard to classify the psalm to the extent you want to put authorship down to King David, for example. One could say this could look a little bit like thinking aloud, like, why am I having so many troubles in how we relate to other peoples? Why aren't people keeping their word? We're keeping ours. Which takes us into the 3rd chapter of Mark's Gospel. We're going to be in chapters 3 through 8 in Mark's Gospel. And this really is the first half of the Gospel, quite literally. I mean, we've got 16 chapters in Mark, and things are going to pivot at the beginning of chapter 9 when the transfiguration of Jesus takes place. If we think of Mark's Gospel sort of being shaped like a big arch, the capstone of that arch is going to be the transfiguration in chapter 9. So we're still leading up to that capstone. And everything up to the transfiguration relates to Jesus' ministry and his exercise of authority in Galilee, including how he's misunderstood by his own disciples. Once we get to the transfiguration, Jesus is revealed for who he is, who he really is. He's literally transfigured before their eyes, and the narrative shifts. Now the narrative moves to Jesus turning his face to Jerusalem and journeying to Jerusalem to fulfill all the prophecies about him, to be crucified and to atone for the sins of the world, to go to the cross, in other words. Once Jesus is revealed as the Christ in the transfiguration, that identity points to the cross, and Jesus predicts his own passion. So we see that arch structure. Here we are still leading up to the transfiguration, and Jesus is initially received positively in Galilee, although we pointed out before that Galilee is not all Jewish. Galilee, north of Samaria. We're in an area where there are a lot of non-Jews. There's a lot of Greek and Roman influence. We're near the major highway from Damascus down to the Mediterranean Ocean. And so the Jews who are in Galilee tend to be kind of nationalists, more Jewish than the Jewish sometimes, which is why in Jesus' hometown synagogue, people take offense at him when he talks about, in Luke's Gospel, for example, when he talks about how in the days of Elijah the prophet, there were many widows, but Elijah went to the widow of Zarephath, in other words, a non-Jewish woman. There were many lepers, but Elisha cured the leprosy of Naaman the Syrian, in other words, the commander of the enemy army. The hometown people who are kind of nationalistic here are offended by that. And Jesus, we see elements of that pushback in Mark's gospel as well. There's a really interesting example of Jesus exercising his authority here. He's initially received positively in Galilee. He appoints his 12 disciples, teaches, and he exercises authority in miracles. He doesn't really teach in parables the way he does in Matthew and Luke. Mark is all economy of narration, which is why we should really pay attention when we get to the 5th chapter of Mark and we actually get one long story. When Mark gives us a lot of detail, rather than throwing in his favorite word immediately, uthus, and sending us to the next action point, we should pay attention. Why is he dwelling on all this detail? Well, the detail in chapter 5 all relates to the Garrison Demoniac. Jesus crosses the Sea of Galilee and he comes to this man who's been bound in fetters, iron fetters, but he keeps breaking his chains, and he lives amongst the tombs, which is automatically making him unclean. And he comes bounding up to Jesus and says, have you come to torment us? I know who you are. And Jesus quickly demonstrates that he knows who he's dealing with, that he's dealing with a demon. And he says, what is your name? And the demon says, we are legion, for we are many. Now we get a hint that we're not in Jewish territory here, because when Jesus goes to cast the demons out of the man, they ask for leave to go into the herd of swine. Jews don't keep pigs. We're on the other side of the lake here, and there's a large herd of 2,000 swine, and the demons enter the swine and go down into the water and are destroyed. The locals show up because the swineherds run away, and the reaction of the locals is to ask Jesus to leave. They're scared by all this. But we get all this detail about the man, about his life before Jesus shows up, about this interaction with Jesus, about what happens afterwards. What's going on with all that detail? Well, what's going on is Mark is reinforcing one of his principal theological points in his gospel. A point that arises in chapter 3 and is repeated in chapter 12. So we get it on both sides of the arc. And this is where Jesus says that in order to take the household of a strong man, in order to plunder his goods, in order to overthrow him, you first have to tie him up. The strong man must be bound by one who is stronger. What Jesus, in Mark's story of the Garrison Demoniac, the reason Mark's giving us all the detail is that Jesus is the stronger one who is binding the householder. In other words, he has entered our world. God has been incarnated amongst us. We are being ruled by dark powers, by the devil. Jesus comes to pronounce judgment on the devil, tie him up essentially, and declare victory. So both in chapter 3 and chapter 12, he talks about binding, the stronger one, binding the householder. Here it happens in chapter 5. I think that's why Mark gives us all that detail, that we can see that exercise by the one who is stronger of his ultimate power. Now, despite all these demonstrations of authority, healing the sick, casting out demons, stilling the storm, the disciples really do not get it. even though it says that they ask the question when he stills the storm on the Sea of Galilee, who is this then who stills the storm? They don't quite get that in order to exercise that level of authority, you have to have that level of power. They're not just dealing with a human being. Throughout Mark's gospel, Jesus is not properly identified by his own, only by outsiders, like the demon, like the blind man Bartimaeus, like the centurion in the execution party. Jesus is misunderstood by his own disciples, and from this description of his near rejection by his own disciples or his own people, the narrative flows through a series of incidents in which the disciples fail to realize who Jesus is and what this means, even though he engages in a series of acts of power. There's the feeding of the 5,000. There are the healings in chapter 6. The healings continue with those of a Gentile woman's daughter in chapter 7, the famous story of the Saira Phoenician woman. A man incapable of speech, interrupted by a narrative of controversy over ritual purity. And we see two kind of interesting things happening there. The first is in the feeding of the 5,000, Mark is a lot more direct than the other synoptic gospels, because when Jesus is being chased around by people who want him to perform miracles now, he's withdrawn to the wilderness. He's gone off to a lonely place, a deserted place. The word that Mark uses in Greek for that is eramon. And what eramon means in Greek is a deserted place in the sense of a desert. You know, we're supposed to picture a rocky, dry place out in the middle of nowhere. Now, hold that thought in terms of where we're supposed to be, because at that point the crowd shows up. Jesus looks upon them, and it says that he takes pity on them because they're like sheep without a shepherd. And then it says that he has them to sit down or lie down in companies on the green grass. Time out, excuse me. We're supposed to be in the desert. Where'd all the green grass come from? We're supposed to pay attention here that this is the 23rd Psalm being enacted, being embodied. If you go back to the 23rd Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd. Jesus takes pity on the crowd because they're like sheep without a shepherd. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He has them lie down on the grass. He sets a rich table before me. The miracle of the loaves and the fishes. Goes on about, yea, though I walk through the valley of the death, I shall fear no evil, for thy rod and thy staff comfort me. In other words, Jesus is present as the Lord. So chapter 6, Mark makes it abundantly clear that the Lord is my shepherd, as recited in the psalm, is being physically incarnated by Jesus to his people. And they still don't quite get it. They're just after the bread and the fish. In the case of the Syro-Phoenician woman, whom Luke calls a Canaanite woman, this is what? Syro-Phoenician. That means not Jewish. And so Jesus' exchange with her can come across as kind of harsh, because she comes and says, heal my daughter, and he says, I've been sent only to the house of Israel. And she pleads with Jesus, and he says, it's not fair to take the bread of the children and cast it to the dogs. Now that's a major insult in the ancient Near East, to call somebody a dog. So is Jesus just being harsh? Is he being exclusive? Is he being, mean? Look at what's happening. There's an exchange between a woman and a man. A Gentile woman and a Jewish man who's identified as a rabbi. The woman isn't even supposed to talk to Jesus. She's not supposed to talk to anybody without a male guardian present, her husband or father, somebody in authority over her. So she's demonstrating a whole lot of chutzpah, and also a whole lot of initiative, and also a lot of courage in coming to Jesus and talking to him at all. In fact, it says that she seeks him out, so we're led to believe that she may have even crossed the threshold and come into a Jewish household. This is real courage. So Jesus is kind of given back as good as he gets. There's a little back and forth going on here. Every time he sort of challenges her back. she challenges him back. And when he talks about, don't throw the bread to the dogs, she says, but even the dogs can be under the table and lick up the crumbs. She has now really demonstrated her faith that she, as an outsider, knows who Jesus is. So we're supposed to read this all together and say, the insiders, the Jews, Jesus' immediate disciples, they don't quite get who Jesus is. Here's another outsider who does. And Jesus says, for your faith, let it be done as you wish. And the woman's daughter is healed. That's a signal to the rest of us that Jesus' message is to all of us, outsiders as well as insiders, but that we have to respond to him. We have to recognize who he is when he reveals himself. This is all leading up to the transfiguration and then turning to the cross. And we reach that turning point. In chapter 8, Jesus gets into a dispute with the Pharisees. They seek a sign, and he's not going to give them a sign. He's going to turn to Jerusalem and fulfill God's plan. Immediately following that dispute, we get Jesus foretelling his own passion, saying what's going to happen, and the narrative then moves to the transfiguration, where he is revealed in his full glory as who he is. The stage is now set for instruction on who and what the Christ and his mission are, all of which will be demonstrated in the journey to Jerusalem and in the Passion. That's where we end for this week. We'll pick up our narrative in Leviticus next week. We'll go all the way through the end of Leviticus. We'll continue in the Psalms, and we'll get almost to the end of Mark's Gospel.